Judge Grayson leaned back in his chair, looking down at the teenager before him with a contemptuous smile. A young defendant, facing serious charges, no lawyer, no one to defend him. Only the heavy silence that filled the courtroom, punctuated by snickers. Everyone thought this trial would be over quickly, until the boy opened his mouth. A sharp question stunned the prosecutor. An argument strong enough to turn the entire case around. No one expected that this teenager had spent his entire childhood studying law, and today he was not just the defendant, but also his own attorney. Could a boy defeat a system that even adults feared? Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. Share your city or country in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow, we'll bring you another inspiring story, crafted just for you. The story begins. Judge Grayson thought he was sentencing an ignorant teenager until the defendant began analyzing the case like a seasoned lawyer. The atmosphere in the Los Angeles County Court was thick, almost suffocating. Rows of spectators filled the courtroom, whispering as they watched the proceedings. The defendant's table looked too large for the young man standing beside it. Hands in his pockets, chin slightly raised just enough to show he wasn't afraid. Ethan Dawson, 19, was charged with car theft and resisting arrest. The charges were serious, but the way Judge Richard Grayson looked at him suggested the trial had little to do with law. Grayson leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping a lazy rhythm on the polished wooden surface of his desk. He looked down at Ethan through his glasses, his lips twisted into something between a smug smile and a sneer. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" His voice carried a hint of dry amusement. "This isn't a debate club, kid." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The court clerk, the stenographer, even the prosecutor, all joined in the jest. Ethan didn't flinch, he didn't smile. He'd spent years preparing for this moment. Not exactly this moment. He never planned on standing here as a defendant. But he knew courtrooms like the back of his hand. While other kids memorized basketball statistics, he memorized case law. While his friends played video games, he played out mock trials in his head, arguing imaginary cases with himself. His mother, Sarah Dawson, had been a paralegal for over 20 years, and Ethan had grown up listening to the stories she brought home. How prosecutors cut corners, how judges showed bias, how some defense attorneys barely tried. He absorbed it all. By the time he was 14, he could analyze a trial better than most law students. But none of that mattered to Grayson. To him, Ethan was just another kid in trouble. "Let's make this quick," the judge sighed, flipping open the case file. "I have a tea time at 2. The audience chuckled again, but this time something had shifted. Ethan's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, because Grayson had just made his first mistake. But the courtroom didn't realize it yet. Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington rose from his seat with the air of a man who had already won his case. His suit was sharp, his tie perfectly knotted, and his voice carried the practiced confidence of someone who had given the same speech hundreds of times before. "Your Honor, the prosecution will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Ethan Dawson, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Audi A6, reported missing only hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through the downtown area, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The prosecution contends that the evidence speaks for itself." The words hung heavy. The courtroom buzzed, the crowd whispering amongst themselves. On the surface, it sounded damning. A stolen car, a chase, fleeing. Judge Grayson glanced at Ethan over his glasses, then back at Carrington. "Proceed." The prosecutor strode towards the jury box, his polished shoes clicking on the floor. "The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding, that young Dawson here is merely an unfortunate victim of circumstance." He turned, for the first time looking directly into Ethan's eyes. "But let's be honest, what kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension in the room thickened. Judge Grayson leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. Ethan didn't blink. Carrington continued flipping through a stack of papers. "Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before attempting to flee. The vehicle was confirmed stolen. The arrest made by the book. Grayson exhaled through his nose, nodding. Sounds open and shut, and to most in the room it probably did. The case was straightforward. A stolen car, a chase, an arrest. But Ethan had spent too many years studying trials not to see the cracks. He remained silent, watching and waiting. Judge Grayson tapped his gavel lightly. "All right, let's hear from the defense." He turned to Ethan's lawyer, an appointed public defender named Lisa Thornton, who had barely spoken 3 words since entering the courtroom. She stood up, shifting nervously. Ethan placed a hand on her arm, a silent request for her to remain seated. She hesitated, then sat back down. And for the first time, Ethan spoke. "Your Honor, I will be representing myself." The room fell silent. Grayson stared at him, clearly amused. "You'll... what?" Ethan's voice was calm, steady. "I will be representing myself." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The court clerk's eyebrows shot up. Carrington's smug smile wavered for a moment, before he let out a sharp laugh. "This is going to be interesting." But no one laughed as Ethan took his first step forward, because everything was about to change. The weight of the courtroom settled on Ethan as he adjusted his stance, hands still in his pockets. He let the silence linger a moment longer, just enough to make them uncomfortable. Finally, he spoke. "Your Honor, before we begin, I'd like to clarify something with the prosecution." Carrington raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "Go ahead." Ethan slowly stepped forward. "You stated that Officer Daniel Ruiz witnessed me behind the wheel before my arrest, correct?" Carrington gave a sharp exhale, clearly exasperated. "Yes, and that testimony is in his report, of course." Ethan nodded, then turned to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, I move to strike that testimony from the record." Grayson narrowed his eyes. "On what grounds?" Ethan removed his hands from his pockets for the first time and gestured towards the prosecution's table. "Because Officer Ruiz did not see me in that vehicle. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the pursuit began." A flicker of unease crossed Carrington's face. "What are you talking about?" Ethan took another step forward. "Your Honor, if the court permits, I'd like to submit a request for the verification of Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report states he witnessed me in the car, then it should align with his location history." He let the statement hang in the air. "I have a feeling it won't." The murmuring in the courtroom grew louder. Grayson frowned, glancing at Carrington. Carrington cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. "This report was filed by a law enforcement officer, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional?" Ethan gave a slight, almost indifferent shrug. "If the officer was where he claims, the GPS data will prove it. But if he wasn't..." He trailed off. Grayson studied him for a long moment, then turned to Carrington. "Does the prosecution have an issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs?" Carrington hesitated. The pause was long enough for the jury to notice, the audience to notice, and most importantly, the judge to notice. Ethan silently exhaled. He'd spent years watching trials, studying prosecutors, their tactics, how they manipulated the system. And there was one thing he knew for sure. If Carrington were confident in his case, he wouldn't be stalling. Grayson sighed, rubbing his temples. Carrington finally shook his head. "No objection, Your Honor." But the shift had begun. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing. The courtroom was silent, but the tension was deafening. Carrington shuffled his papers, his polished confidence beginning to crack. "Your Honor, while we await the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." Ethan nodded slightly, his face unreadable. "That's correct." He stepped forward. "But let's talk about that evidence for a moment." Grayson raised an eyebrow, gesturing for him to continue. Ethan turned to the jury, making eye contact with each of them. "The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints in a car means I stole it. That's the story they're selling. But let's think logically." He took a deep breath, his voice still calm, controlled. Suppose you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, then put it back on the rack and walk out. Hours later, someone steals that jacket. Does the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it? A few jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery muttered something. Ethan didn't give them time to recover. The vehicle in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven a few hours before the alleged theft. I was in that store with 3 friends, and yes, as we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was unlocked. I didn't think much of it, didn't take the car, didn't drive it, didn't steal anything inside, just a moment of stupid curiosity. He let that sink in for a second. Then, in a voice that cut through the silence like a scalpel, he asked, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Carrington cleared his throat, flipping through his notes, searching for something, anything to regain control. Ethan wasn't finished. And while we're on the subject, let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was conducted. He turned to Grayson. "Your Honor, was the forensic expert from this case subpoenaed to testify?" Grayson blinked, taken aback by the question. He glanced at Carrington. The prosecutor hesitated, then reluctantly said, "No." Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. "So let me get this straight. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual expert who processed that evidence. No chance for me to cross-examine, ask about the chain of custody, or challenge the accuracy of the analysis." Carrington's jaw tightened. Ethan nodded, as if that was all he needed to hear. "Interesting." Judge Grayson sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. It was the face of a man realizing this case wasn't going to be the easy win he'd thought. But Ethan wasn't finished, because what he was about to say next would change everything. Ethan slowly stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence a sworn statement from the car's owner." Grayson frowned. "The owner?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Audi, provided a statement to the police that, for some reason, was never filed in the prosecution's record. And I think I know why." He turned to Carrington. "Do you recall what Mr. Whitaker told the officers the night his car was reported missing?" Carrington's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what was coming. Ethan didn't wait for him to answer. Instead, he pulled out a printout from his file and read aloud. "I left the car running when I ran into the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and driven off. But it wasn't the kid you caught. I saw the kid, and he was white." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Ethan held up the paper. "This is from the original police report, the same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned." He turned back to Judge Grayson. "The arresting officer admitted this in his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. Yet they want the jury to believe that I, who don't even match the description of the actual thief, am guilty beyond a reasonable doubt." Carrington stepped forward, flustered. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was apprehended in possession of the vehicle." But Ethan shook his head. "No, I wasn't." His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the courtroom with sharp precision. "I was arrested several blocks from where the car was abandoned, walking home after getting snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I didn't run from anything. The only thing that ties me to this case is shoddy police work and assumptions." Judge Grayson slowly exhaled, rubbing his temples. The case was rapidly unraveling, and everyone knew it. Ethan turned back to the jury. "The real suspect got away that night. The officers found a black kid in the general area and decided that was close enough. That's what this case is really about." Silence. Grayson cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. "Prosecution. Anything further?" Carrington stood rigid, his face flushed. "No, Your Honor." Judge Grayson exhaled. He looked at Ethan for a long moment, then glanced at the jury. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke the words that would linger in everyone's minds. "Case dismissed." A beat of stunned silence, then pandemonium. Half the courtroom erupted, some in disbelief, some in quiet relief. The gallery buzzed, reporters scribbling in their notebooks. Ethan didn't move immediately. He let the moment settle, let the reality sink in. Judge Grayson, still gripping his gavel, looked at Ethan with an unreadable expression. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, perhaps recognition, even regret. Ethan met his gaze, then turned to leave. But as he reached the door, the judge spoke again. "Mr. Dawson." Ethan paused, but didn't turn around. Grayson hesitated, then finally said, "You should consider law school." Ethan smirked. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. Outside the courthouse, the air crackled with voices. Reporters swarmed the steps, their cameras flashing, microphones thrust out like weapons. "Mr. Ethan, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What will you do next? How does it feel to outsmart a seasoned prosecutor?" Ethan pulled his hood up, ignoring the questions. He didn't care about the spectacle. This wasn't about proving how smart he was. It was about something bigger. His mother, Sarah, was waiting for him at the bottom of the steps, arms crossed, face unreadable. For a long moment, she just looked at him, then finally shook her head and exhaled. "Son, you scared me half to death." Ethan chuckled, scratching his head. "Gotta take risks, Mom." She looked at him for another second, then pulled him into a tight hug. "You always were stubborn." The cameras continued to flash, but Ethan didn't notice them anymore. Across the street, leaning against his car, Judge Grayson was watching. His posture was different now. The arrogance was gone. His expression wasn't amused anymore, but something else, almost like contemplation. He hadn't expected this case to be anything more than a routine procedure. Just another day, another defendant, another guilty plea. But now he knew he would remember this case because Ethan had done what most people never could. He'd made the system look at itself, and for the first time, it blinked. This is the lesson we should take away. How many other cases have played out this way? How many people have been convicted not because of evidence, but because of bias, shortcuts, and a system more concerned with closing cases than finding the truth? Ethan had the knowledge to fight back. But what about those who didn't? This wasn't just about one case. It was about all of them. He knew what he had to do next. This courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stood in, but next time he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the lawyer. And when that day came, he wouldn't be the only one. What did you think of this trial? If you were in Jalen's position, would you have had the courage to stand up for the truth? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice could be a powerful inspiration for those fighting for justice. This story reminds us that knowledge is power, and sometimes it only takes one person to stand up to change an entire system. If you found this story meaningful, share it with your friends and family to spread the message of justice, courage, and perseverance. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next inspiring stories. Let's create change together. One story, one small act, to make this world a better place. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. These stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individuals or organizations. They are shared for the purpose of promoting humanistic values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any errors, please overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.